In today's video, we're going to be focused on different EQ scenarios and specifically try to focus in on using Bitwig's EQ Plus. It's not really a tutorial about the EQ Plus. EQ is always very straightforward, but just some different applications where you might go to it. At the end of the video, we will do again, like we did with the saturator, slightly broader perspective on how useful, how usable it is, and how much you might plan on using it, depending on the type of music producer that you are. Now, what we have here is a pretty busy, pretty full, washed out little sketch, and we're going to listen to some different parts of it. And as we're listening through, let's try to think about where we might want to use and apply EQ. I was personally surprised just how much that I wanted to go to the EQ. And as I was making this, I was thinking in the back of my head, this is a video I want to make. I'm not going to use EQ. And I ended up lying to myself because there were many times where I did go in and use some filtering. I didn't do any bands on an EQ, but I did do a little bit of filtering. So anyway, let's just go ahead and listen to this and then we will get started. So I'm going to jump around a bit. Everything for this particular track was made using stock Bitwig stuff. So Bitwig devices, Bitwig samples. I don't even think I used the grid at all. Okay, so that's pretty much, I think, all you need to hear. First things first, when you are doing EQ, and especially the first type that we're going to look at, it is helpful to turn things up a little bit. You, of course, want things to sound good at all volume levels, but especially when you're producing and if you're mixing as you go and you're using EQ, you need to be aware that the final master is probably going to be brought up fairly significantly, depending on the levels you work at. If you already have a mastering chain where you're pumping the volume with like a multi-band compressor and a limiter, as a lot of people do, then you don't need to do this. But in my case, I'm not actually driving into the peak limiter at all. So I would need to turn things up a little bit. The other thing to watch out for is your room itself and those resonant frequencies that exist within your room. Before you do any sort of fix-it EQ, so not like blending, not shaping, not making space for something else, okay, in the mix, you got to be careful that you're not just like throwing notch filters in left and right, because you've heard people say like this is the steps to take with every single signal with EQ. Because unless your room is really, really well treated, there's going to be some frequencies that pop out. So whenever I do fix-it EQ, that is one time, and it's always going to be in the mixing stage for me, so it would be later than where we're at now. I pop the headphones in, I turn the volume way up because I feel very confident with my headphones when it comes to the fix-it application. And when I keep saying fix-it, what I mean is there's something wrong with the recording, or there's something wrong with the audio file that you have. Like something is ringing out, something is clearly not where it's supposed to be, and it's popping out, it's annoying you, it's probably going to annoy your listeners. Not always, but you know, it could. The other time when you do fix it, and this is the more obvious and easy one, is when you have subsonics building up and you do the classic high pass filter move. Now, when I'm making music, I actually try not to do too much of the high pass filtering stuff. I'll do that in the mix. And the reason why is like, I just don't want to have to slow down. Now, I do have, and I encourage almost everybody to do this, I do have a preset that is called low and high pass filters, and all I have to do is search low, and it's the first thing that comes up. And you'll see that by default, it comes up like this with the high pass filter already enabled and on and at 30 hertz. And this is the way that I'll do it. So I just usually bring this up and then turn that up to get the desired effect that I want. And we are going to use that actually, I think, first in this example, just so you can see what I'm talking about. One place where I think we could do a little fixed EQ is on this breakdown sound. And we're going to go through some of the different solutions. Now, when we listen to it, what we're going to hear, or what I hear, is some resonances peaking out. So let's just listen to it. And we can kind of see those peaks, and it's more so with that first overtone. So our fundamental, then our first overtone here, that I think is causing the problem. It's not a massive problem, and in relation with everything else that's playing, I'm not too concerned with it, but it is something that we could address and we could clean up. The louder we're listening to it, the more those things are going to kind of peak out and be annoying. And when I'm listening to it, I can hear it. So what we will start with, though, is probably just doing a little bit of that high-pass filtering. So you can see there's all this energy down here that we can get rid of. On the master, what I always do is I bring something in, and you can see that I've brought it in here around 30 hertz. So that cleans up any of like the really bad subsonics. But in this case, and with a lot of cases, there is some gunk down there you can fix. I think we'll go with the steeper one in this case. I know we got some lower notes, so I don't want to cut any of those off. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. All right, so we are going to use our EQ. Notice that I use the EQ and not the EQ plus. You can use whatever you want. For me, the benefit of this is I just have two bands. I can only use, one of them. I feel like that puts a very, very small footprint, and that's the purpose of that device. So I don't want to be tempted to do anything else with it, and that's why I use it. Now, in this example, because we still have access to the patch and because we can see the chain, I can start to ask myself, well, what is causing those resonances to peak out? And with a phase modulation type synthesizer, we know that when we apply that modulation, that's generating those side bands. And if the modulation amount is too high, we might be pushing some of those too hard. So the first thing I would probably do is just come in here with the global mod, and I would just turn that down. And if I turn that down a little bit, my expectation is that it would probably fix the problem, especially in relation with all the other instruments. I might bring it down to this range somewhere. That has made a big difference. I'd probably compensate for that a little bit on volume, but that would be one solution. I wouldn't even need to use EQ. And whenever you don't have to use EQ, that's always a good thing, right? The fewer processors you have, the better, honestly. The other option and the other thing I see, and this should be a dead giveaway to you guys too, is that there's a saturator on here. And with the saturator, we actually don't have a way of high passing the signal as it comes in, which is what I would want to do here. Because again, I can tell that it's like that very first overtone that's causing all of those issues. That's what's really sticking out to me. And so what I would do in this case is instead of saturating the whole signal and using this low pass, what I would probably do is say, okay, let me use a multi-band effects. I'm just going to bring that up. And if we're looking at the, well, we can actually even attempt to do it here. Why not? Just so you guys see what I'm talking about. I'm just going to use some multi-band effects too in this case. And I do want to look at the signal though here in the EQ too. Okay, so we're looking around maybe 600 to 700 hertz. Which is actually right about where it is. Like that would probably be fine. I'd put the saturator in the highs, and now I am gonna have to probably drive it a lot harder. Compensate for it. And now what that's doing is it's eliminating that drive going into those first two. I don't particularly like the way that sounds here, but that would be one thing I would probably try to do if what I did originally wasn't going to work. So let's go ahead now and just kind of bring this back. It's going to be out of control. Okay, that's good enough. Now, the other option that we have is trying to isolate the problem frequency and notch it out. But the problem with this, and this is the common issue, is that it's bouncing all over the place. There's a lot of different notes, and they're all kind of having that same issue. But how can I isolate, that area extended? And I really can't. But what I would do in this case is I'd probably bring in the EQ plus, because this one allows us to isolate out those bands. I'm going to create a band here. I'm going to bring it up by about 6 to 7. Okay, and then I'm going to click the top to isolate and just hear what's going on in this band. And say, yep, that's a problem. And now we're going to take some of that out. And again, that helps a little bit. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it does make a difference. You could always go in here and create a notch. The reason why I would not do the notch is that it's really going to impact the body of the sound. It's like thin that thing out like crazy. In certain genres of music where more stuff is going on, you can get away with it. But in this particular genre, you don't want to lose that. You don't want to lose that energy. So what I would do in this situation, and again, we're probably really focused on small details here. What I would do is I probably wouldn't use the EQ Plus, and I would use the TDR Nova. And I'm going to show you guys what I'm going to do. I'm going to basically do a dynamic EQ where it tries to analyze the signal for me, and it's going to kind of tell me where those resonances are and kind of smooth those out a little bit. And I could do this using the EQ Plus, but it's going to take a decent amount of work, and I don't really want to do that. So here's what I would do. So let's bring in the Nova. Okay, and let's loop this area and go over to our smart ops, and I'm just going to go ahead and have it learn this. We're getting those peaks. Go ahead and stop it. Also, can just solo it. And now what I'm going to ask it to do is I'm going to ask it to do a dynamic deresonate. And especially here where I want to keep that low energy, I just want to catch those resonant peaks. Dynamic is the way to go. So it's only pulling it down when there's too much energy there. And then let's go ahead and let's apply it. And let's now listen to and hear what's happened. And I'm usually very impressed by how well it actually does. Like, that's kind of exactly what I want. Like, visually looking at it, that's what I was expecting it should do, and that's what it does. So that would be the way that I would kind of apply the fix-it EQ. There's nothing wrong with the EQ Plus. It's just not going to be able to do what I want to do the way that the Nova can. And that's why I brought it in. Okay, so that would be our first EQ example. With our second example, we're going to take one of our sounds, and we're going to add a little bit of subtle movement to it. But instead of doing it the classic ways where we might use a chorus, a flanger, a phaser, in a way this is kind of like phasing, but not exactly. We're going to use the EQ instead and also take advantage of Bitwig's modulators. So right now let's listen to these strings. they sound nice, but they are just screaming for a little extra, a little movement, if you will. And the way we're going to do that is by using the EQ plus. So let's go in here. Let's grab our EQ plus. This is also something you can do with the EQ5. What I like about the EQ plus is that you can actually see when you adjust the shift, you can see the curves moving around. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to add a couple bands. I'm going to add something in the low mids and add something up a little bit more in the highs. So let's again play it. Now I'm going to add 2 modulators. I'm going to add a basic LFO. And I'm going to add a random. And this is something that you can also just save as a preset. I'm doing it here by scratch, but you can do whatever you want. I'm going to slightly offset it from 2 bars. And let's start by having it play with the volume. And I don't want it to reset, so we're just going to let it go free. Okay. I'm going to do maximum of maybe 3. Same thing on this one. I'll just start it going the other way. Now we're also going to have it moving the frequency. Have this one be a little more aggressive. Why not? And this one I do need to move over a little bit because I don't want it getting all the way down to the fundamentals. So we're not going to have this one move as much, but we will have it moving. Okay, so this in itself is pretty cool. Let's also put it onto the shift control. Okay, so like I'm kind of happy with this, but we need to add some randomness because this is just going to repeat over and over again, and that's where we end up using our random control, which is great. So we can put this onto, why not a half note, then offset it again a little bit, smooth it out, if you will. I'm trying to think about which way I want to go. Let's go this way. Have this working in bipolar. And yeah, that's fine. And now we're going to put this on a few different parameters. Okay. So now we're really getting somewhere. We can even have it maybe play with speed of the LFO. Maybe even play with the shape of the LFO. Okay, so this is fairly drastic. But why not? Might turn off the adaptive for this just to make it even more exciting. If it gets way too out of control or you want it to be more aggressive, you can go in here and just kind of adjust the depths that you've set here. But I like this. I like what it's doing. And again, in context. At the beginning of the track. So it's subtle, and you want it to be subtle, but it's adding something in the background to those strings. It's giving those strings more life. It's giving them more movement. The other thing I would do, just to be careful, because you are adjusting gain here, is I would do a little bit of subtle compression just to save us. Okay, and let's just go ahead and isolate this out again. Go 1 to 2. Bring our threshold way down. Go RMS mode with it and go with a longer release. And this should now smooth out or help to smooth out any drastic changes in the dynamics that are occurring with the strings. All right, cool. So again, that's not mind-blowing. It's probably not really necessary. It's not going to make or break your track, but it is a cool technique that you can use, especially utilizing this EQ+. One other thing to just be made aware of very quickly, something that the EQ5 has that the EQ+ doesn't, is the amount control, which if we think about the amount control, basically what it does is it takes everything that's been added in here and let's just like play this out. Oh boy. And in some ways it's similar to a dry wet control, only what I think it actually does is it takes all of these controls and just starts to pull them back to 0. So it starts to bring those up and out. Unlike using a wet dry, which if you do use wet dry, like even on an effect like this, or sorry, on this, you wouldn't want to put this into a chain and use a dry wet control because you are going to have some phasing issues if you do that. So just be aware that is one difference between the EQ5 and the EQ+. And actually, it's a reason why if you're doing like DJing and you want to have like, let's put this onto the master real quick. If you want to do maybe like a really unique kind of effect, and let's put this before the peak limiter. Like you can do some really cool and unique stuff with this, especially have it mapped to MIDI knobs. But what's nice is that you also have control over amount. Okay, so you can pull it in and out with the effect. So I could say, okay, I want about that much. And then, you could kill it or whatever using the amount control. So just something to be aware of that the EQ5 has that the EQ+ does not. Our next example is going to be really basic and simple tonal shaping. And this is the sort of thing that you're always doing in context. So you want something to maybe pop out a little bit more. We'll start with like a really simple static example, and then we're going to do a lot more dynamically and like side chaining, which is something that I think in Bitwig with EQ is just so easy and so obvious to understand that it's a great technique to use. I don't see a lot of people doing it, but it's something that I do pretty much all the time, and it's like a basic hack to get certain things to be more prevalent, especially where they're important. But here's an example where when we have the pluck and the counter playing at the same time, I'm going to use the EQ5 to figure out what's important in the pluck and then kind of boost some stuff in the counter around it so that they're not necessarily fighting, but that this does pop out just a little bit more. Should allow me to turn it down more in the mix as well. You can see we could definitely use this here. So this is where it's really important, the plug. So we're actually going to be adjusting the balance of the counter, but I don't even want to see the spectrum of it because all I really care about is just making room around the pluck. So as you can hear, that helps kind of pop this out a little bit more, and it's not a major difference again, but it would be something that I would probably consider doing with EQ. That is very basic, fundamental kind of EQ work, but you notice with the EQ Plus how easy it is to go in here and set something different as your reference and just do that subtle little tone sculpting around it. Obviously we could go in here and we could get really aggressive with like our kick or our clap sound and make a wild curve to try to accentuate certain things. But in this given example, I don't really think that's necessary. And I'm more of the belief, and there's nothing right or wrong about this, but if you're looking at your EQ curve and you're seeing really wild, crazy stuff, it might be that you've picked the wrong sound and you're trying to force it in there when really there might be a sample that exists that's better for you. Either way, to each their own. I just know that I don't like to do that, but again, there's nothing wrong with that in the computer. There's nothing wrong with having a wild curve on your EQ Plus if it gets you the sound that you're looking for. I know some people disagree, but again, to each their own. The final thing we're going to look at is, and this is again my kind of go-to move, is to use your modulators and to use the audio sidechain to really only pull stuff out of the way when you need to make room. So let's go ahead, and I think really we are going to be focused on these few instruments down here. And I think we will kind of look at the pluck and the counter first and figure out what we want moving. And what I would probably have, let's see. Is because we're so used to the pluck from earlier in the track, that's probably the thing that I could have ducking out of the way when the counter melody is playing. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I could also have the counter melody actually boost up when parts of the pluck are playing, but in this case, let's do it this way. So we're going to go in here onto the pluck. We are going to use the EQ Plus, and right away, we are going to go ahead and we are going to add in our audio sidechain. And we just have to make sure we set this up correctly. So this is going to react to the counter, and I'll just put it on pre. And now what's very important to me is I isolate what I want going out. So we can see that in this 400, 440, 420-ish range, that's where we need to get this guy ducking. So we're gonna go in here and we're gonna set something at about 420. And now when that's coming in, this is gonna be ducking out. If I want more of an effect, I can drive this up. Also around 2.4K, I'm gonna do the same thing. That's another important area. And you can actually hear, oops, sorry, I didn't want to do that. You can actually hear the click on that counter sound coming through a little bit clearer. Let's go ahead and bring this up a little bit. But this is only going to occur when the counter is in, so all the rest of the time, it's just playing back normal. Yep. Nice. We can make it a little more extreme if we want. You can hear the pluck and the reverb just being sucked away when that comes in. And now in context with everything else. bounce a little more. Awesome. So I think that works really well. It's not heavy-handed. It's very transparent. That's the beauty of the EQ Plus and the Bitwig modulators in general. So that would be one example of it. The other place we could do something similar would be with the strings and with what's going on here with this BG lead, because again, they kind of occupy the same space. And again, the one that I would have duck out of the way is the strings. Now, the real question is, you know, what do we want to have triggering it? Do we want to do that in this section of the track? And honestly, I don't want to do it in that section of the track because I kind of like this sounding a little bit mysterious, which means that I'm going to use this lead layer to be the trigger to duck some stuff out of the way on the strings. So let's go into the strings. And don't forget, you could also have other sections be boosted up. So maybe we'll boost a section of the strings. Like we might boost the lows of the strings if we're pulling out other stuff. It all depends on the situation that you're in. Here I used an EQ Plus. What did I do with that? Oh, that was that little movement thing I did. So I'm already behind the curve. So again, I'm just going to solo out these layers, these areas. And let's do it in this section. This area. And if you want to, don't forget that you can bring up the spectrum in here as well. Maybe we'll do that this time, just for fun. I want the whole guy here. So we can see exactly what we need to get rid of. This is gonna be the lead layer pre again, just so we get more energy. But let's start ducking it at these key points. Here and here. All right. So now let's listen to it in context. We'll just see if that's coming through better. You can hear again how much space it makes. And what I would even almost consider doing is saying, hey, like we could lift the lows a little bit if we wanted to here as well, or the extreme highs of the strings when this is coming in, if we want to still fill out that space. So it's not just cutting. Why don't we go ahead and do it with a shelf? Right to there. A little gain. We'll listen to it one more time just with these two items soloed so you can hear the difference it's making. Here the strings get out of the way. And the other nice thing about this, because we're using that higher layer, is that when we go in and we look at the strings here at the beginning, we shouldn't be seeing this EQ do anything. So looking at this, and again, this is maybe getting, you always have to have a good track to begin with. So some of these little tricks and tips mean very little if you don't have that. Like, this is not a particularly interesting or good track, but for the listener on more of a subconscious level, adding this in on the second time does even more, because the actual frequency balance of those instruments is changing, specifically of the strings. Like, that's now different. And your ear, you may not notice it because everything's blending together, but your ear is going to be thinking, what's going on there, as your brain is processing the music that's being fed to you. So last thing we're going to look at before finishing up this video is I'm going to take a few different EQs. We're going to highlight out a busy section of the track, and I'm going to process it identical settings, equal gain match. We're going to listen to a few different versions, and I'll see if you guys maybe have a favorite, or if you really can pick something out that you think as being superior to everything else. So get ready, get your ears tuned in, because we're going to do a little listening test. With our final example, I've taken 5 different EQs, as well as one version without any EQ, put it on the master bus. And with each of those EQs, I've used the exact same bands and gain amount. Now, the Q varied a little bit. So on ones where I was able to select the Q, I did that to ear, I did that to taste. And then there are a couple examples with these EQs where you don't have control over that. So it's kind of preset already. And the purpose of this is not to go through and determine a best and a worst and make a ranking. Rather, it's just to hear that EQ can vary pretty drastically. Now, there were a couple examples where it's probably more than just EQ. Like, they've also tried to emulate saturation characteristics or other internal components of analog circuitry. How accurately or unaccurately doesn't really matter. We're just going to be listening to the differences, but it will go to show that there is a lot of variety here. Everything has also been level matched, so every single one of these is peaking out at -1. So let's go ahead and listen to these. We won't listen through to the whole bit, but if you want to, in the comments, you can leave your thoughts on what color you prefer, or if you want to try to take a guess at what any of these are. That's always a fun exercise, but I know coming through YouTube and depending on what you're listening back to, this can be very different. Okay, so there you have it. I believe that the settings were, and don't quote me on this exactly, but I think it was a shelf at 35 hertz, a bell at 3.6K, and then a shelf at 16 hertz. And every single one of these had the EQ plus high pass filter set to 30 hertz as well. So, with the exception of this one at none, where there was no additional EQ put on there. And again, the point of this is not to try to do some kind of a shootout. I'm not a huge believer in that, because depending on the source material and depending on how the track has been mixed and the arrangement from the beginning, that can really throw off like shootouts, right? It really depends. But listening back to those, there's definitely one that I prefer. It wasn't what I was expecting to prefer, but that might go back to, again, something that went wrong during the arrangement. So that was our little example. One of those was the EQ Plus. One of those was the EQ5. So both of those are Bitwig. One of those was the TDR Slick EQ in German mastering mode. One of those was the Lindell, oh my gosh, it's the Lindell Neve emulation, and I believe we used like the 84 mode for the high shelf, and we also used the Fab filter Pro Q as well, just because that's a very popular one that I know lots of people use. So anyway, those were the ones that were used in that example. And yeah, hopefully that was insightful to you guys in some way. At the end of the day, you have to remember that depending on your priorities as a music producer or like a mix engineer or a mastering engineer, something like this may not matter that much to you. You're always thinking that really sought after mix engineers, they're paid a lot of money because they kind of have a pulse on what they really think the average listener is going to prefer. And that's how they make those decisions. So they try to pick what they think is most complementary, what they think the average listener is going to be drawn to the most. So just because your ear might prefer something different doesn't mean that you're wrong in the selections you're making. It doesn't mean that you're wrong in the curves that you're selecting. It's just a matter of personal choice. And then again, experience and seeking out a particular sound. So to wrap up, we'll just have a few final thoughts. So some final thoughts on the EQ Plus. I think it is an amazing EQ. I think it takes what Bitwig had in terms of EQ and really just exponentially expands things. Not only is it just easier to work with and how quickly you can kind of just select and draw these in, you also have the ability to isolate bands. You have a very easy system for working with the spectrum analysis, and you have a very good sort of referencing system as well if you want to go in and use that. The adaptive EQ feature, adaptive Q is nice if that's something that you're used to from other EQs. Clearly, this has taken a lot of inspiration from something like the Fab filter EQ. I think Ableton has a more advanced EQ as well, or something like the Slate Infinity EQ. I don't know which one came first, but they're very similar. A couple of things about it that might annoy some people. It's not really a problem for me. As you guys saw, I never actually expanded out the view. I don't think I would ever work with the EQ in this mode. And the main reason is when I'm doing EQ, there's usually a lot of other things going on. So I can never think of a time where I've kind of used EQ and would bring this all the way in and then close it back down. What I think would be nice, and this is again not really a big deal, but would be able to save your default preset where you could almost preset the size of this window and have it come up with the pop out. And that would be very similar to the way that you would work with a regular plugin. For every other Bitwig device though, that's not really something that you need. So this is kind of the only device where that would be useful. And I don't think that should be a high priority for them or anything like that. The other thing that would probably be nice for some people is having just built-in mid-side functionality. For me, that's not that big of a deal. I saved a preset that's just called mid-side EQ plus. And what's really cool about this is if you are working with the mids, but you want the reference spectrum analysis to be what's going on in the sides. I'm sorry, this has been a tough talking day. You can come down to the spectrum analyzer and you can actually tell it, hey, I want it to do the sides, and then you'd be able to see what's happening in the sides with the mid. So no big issue there. I think that's really cool. I don't really use mid-side EQ that much, but if you do, it's there for you. At the end of the day, though, And this is like what I said with the saturator. For people that are new to music production and like working with Bitwig and are new to Bitwig, like this is an amazing tool and you're probably going to use it all the time and you're never going to think to upgrade your EQ to like the FabFilter Pro Q. For people that are already using the Fab filter, you're probably going to continue to use that if that's your go-to EQ, just because that's what you're used to. That's what you're comfortable with. But kudos to Bitwig. They've done a really great job with this EQ, and the fact that, again, you can go in and do a lot of modulation stuff just takes things one step further. And all in all, just a great job with this particular device. I'm very happy it's in there. I'm also happy, and this seems like a small thing, but it's nice to finally have the ability to, with your shelves, go in here and actually change the Q value. That was something that always bothered me for a long time. Not that it's something I think about that much, but just when you would bring this in, with the EQ5 and you wouldn't be able to change that value. Not that it was that big of an issue. I just always felt like, well, I wish I could change that. That seems like a pretty basic function. But now it's here with the EQ Plus. And anyway, I hope you guys have learned something new in this video. I know it was a long one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.